Hey everybody, welcome back to the Exploring Revelation podcast. This is the third episode, and so far we've briefly touched on the uniqueness and difficulty of the book of Revelation as somewhat of an introduction to the book itself. Last time we talked about who wrote it. We came to the conclusion that there was no reason to disagree with the early church and the majority of conservative scholars that tell us that the book was written by the Apostle John. So basically, we're just getting some introductory things out of the way before we start the text itself, and there are a lot of introductory things when it comes to the book of Revelation. We could probably spend just a majority of the next year talking about matters before we get into the text itself. And I know there's some that are itching to get into the text, to have their questions answered. You can always submit those questions, by the way, if you just want to submit them in comments, or you can email me. My name is Colt, COALTR, @gmail.com. You can send those there. But I know that some are itching to get those questions answered, to get into different things about the rapture and the Antichrist and who is all of that. And I'll say at the onset here that my goal isn't to just hurry up and get into those questions. I think they're going to come up in due time, and we're going to talk about them, and we're probably going to spend considerable amount of time on some of those things. But at the onset here, there are just some foundational things that we need to talk about that will really help us understand some of those big questions in the text later on. One of the introductory things that is really important is the date of the book, when it was written. When it comes to some of the other books in the New Testament, the date matters. For instance, some would say that there are books that are attributed to the Apostle Paul, for instance, that were actually written in the 2nd century. So that means that the book couldn't have written by Paul. He wouldn't be alive in the 2nd century, and it was somebody using Paul's name to give the book credibility. That was a common practice. So the dates of these books really matter. So when we date the books of Paul, for instance, there needs to be credible evidence that those books were written in the lifetime of Paul, that they were actually written by him. And for those books, I think any reasonable person looking at the evidence recognizes that those books were written by in the lifetime of Paul. They are said to be written by Paul. And really, there's probably not serious debate amongst those who are on the more conservative and evangelical side of those things. So when it comes to the book of Revelation, the issue is a little bit probably more complex. Not who wrote it, but when he did, right? If you open your Bible, a lot of them, even if it's not a study Bible, it's going to have a little blurb, a little info before the books of the Bible. And if you look at Revelation and you look at the little paragraph or whatever before the book text starts, most of these are going to say that the book of Revelation was written somewhere between 90 and 100 AD. Now, the early church fathers, some of them would agree to this date. Irenaeus, who we mentioned last time, I believe, says that John wrote the book about 96 AD. Jerome, Eusebius, right? We mentioned Eusebius last time, the great historian, says the same thing, that the book was written about 96. That John wrote the book during the persecution of Domitian, and that he was imprisoned on the island of Patmos at that time and wrote the book. Now, I said that this issue was complex. So far, it might seem fairly cut and dry. Just agree with those guys. I named a few church fathers that dated the book rather late. Now, when I say rather late, 96 is late, considering that Paul and Peter died around 67 AD. So the 13 books that are attributed to the Apostle Paul were written prior to his death in 67. This issue is also complex because, for the most part, the historical Christian church until the 1830s believed that a great majority of what was predicted in the book of Revelation was fulfilled in the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. I'm guessing you've put that together, right? If they believe that the events of the book were fulfilled in 70 AD, they must have been predicted and written prior to that event. So you can see how important this discussion is. If the book is dated prior to the destruction of Jerusalem or the Jewish temple, then the events of the book are largely fulfilled during that time. If the book is dated after the destruction of Jerusalem, then even though there probably was some relevance to those who were persecuted at that time, a majority of the events that were spoken of in the book were very future to those reading it. And a lot of people would say they haven't even happened yet. So, an interesting thing, at least I think it's interesting, that historically the church believed that the events in the book, or a majority of the events in the book, were concerning the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD, when the city was destroyed, the temple was burned, the Jews were scattered. What's interesting to me is that one can go through the book of Revelation and look at specific things that Jesus said would happen to the persecutors of the church and see how they happened in AD 70. Of course, one might say something like, well, you can make the book of Revelation fit those things if you want it to, right? The apocalyptical writing style could be made to fit just about anything, right? So on the other side of the coin, we have those so-called prophecy experts today that seem to take the book of Revelation and they fit it into what is going on with the world today, right? The newspaper in one hand, the Bible in the other. Something they've been doing for decades upon decades, right? There's a book, 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Will Be in 1988 by Winslet Edgar. It's a prime example. It was a 124-page booklet that was released on January 1st in 1988 and predicted that the rapture would happen on October 4th, I believe. Of course, we don't want to fall into that same category with the date of the book and say only that it was written before 70 AD, because many of the things described in the book can be made to fit the events of Jerusalem's destruction. We don't want to fall into that same category. But we also realize that we need to look at the evidence and decide when we think the book was written, because that has a major implication on the understanding of the book itself. So in Douglas Kelly's commentary on the book of Revelation, he lists 6 reasons from the book itself, from the book of Revelation itself, that would really seem to indicate that the book was written before 70 AD. So this is what we call internal evidence. And I feel that this evidence is, for me, remarkably compelling. First, Jesus tells the Apostle John that he will come soon in judgment to deal with the situation oppressing the Christians in the 7 churches. Right? In Revelation 1:1, we read, "The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show to his servants the things that must soon take place." Soon take place. And then in verse 3, "For the time is near." What we have here, what has been called time frame references, and I think I'll probably do an entire podcast on those time frame references, right? These here and some others that point to this because they're so interesting. There are so many things in the Bible that we just often skip past, and really these time frame references are some of those things. It's really amazing that many of the eschatological passages or end times passages that we read in Scripture are connected to time frame references. For instance, right at the onset of the book of Revelation, we are told in the span of just a few verses that the things here will take place soon. And if that is the case, it would make sense that the the events of the book of Revelation would pertain to the events of 70 AD and not the events that are thousands upon thousands of years yet in the future. By the way, there are time frame references throughout the book of Revelation. And not only the book of Revelation, but all through the New Testament concerning the coming of Christ. Phrases in the book of Revelation like, I am coming quickly, or the time is near. Those things are repeated. A second point that Kelly makes is he asks an important question in his commentary, and that is, what is meant by his coming? We mentioned that Jesus says repeatedly that he is coming quickly, but what does that mean? Some people assume that they know what that means, or they just read into that meaning. When we look at how the word is often used in the Old Testament and how it's also used in the New Testament, we could easily say that the coming here means a coming in judgment. For instance, in Revelation 1:7, where we read, Behold, he is coming with the clouds, and every eye will see him, even those who had pierced him, and all tribes of earth will wail on account of him. Again, if we interpret the coming here not as his final coming, but his coming in judgment, then it does seem to indicate that the events described here are the ones in 70 AD, which was a judgment on the Jewish world, and we'll get more into that later. Third, in going along with this, Kelly points our attention to the Olivet Discourse, or Matthew 24 and verse 34 specifically. In the middle of what is called the Olivet Discourse, some have called it the mini-apocalypse or mini-revelation, this verse says that this generation will not pass away until all of these things are fulfilled. And of course, the context for that passage is the destruction of the Jewish temple. Jesus says right at the onset there that, look at these stones. They're going to be scattered, and the disciples come back and ask, well, when are these things going to be? So, and then Jesus goes through and tells these things, and he uses apocalyptical language. So the idea is that those living at this time in about 33 AD would experience the coming of the Son of Man in judgment. I would say that the book of Revelation, as well as other passages, speak clearly about a final and coming of Jesus. Don't misunderstand me that there's only one coming of Jesus and it's a coming of Jesus in judgment at 70 AD. That's not what I'm saying. I believe that Jesus is going to come again. I think the Bible makes this extremely clear. But I think the point here is that we do not need to read a final and ultimate coming of Jesus into every passage that mentions Jesus' coming. We have to use some discernment there in understanding what is actually meant in that specific text. We don't make a practice of reading into the text, but letting the text speak. A fourth point that we need to make here is that in Revelation 11, 1 and 2, we read, well, just let me read that. Then I was given a measuring rod like a staff, and I was told, rise and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who are worshiping there, but do not measure the court outside the temple. Leave that out, for it is given over to the nations, and they will trample the holy city for 42 months. So you can see clearly here, I think, that it seems that the temple is still standing. Some might suggest, well, this is some future rebuilt temple. But there's really no reason to believe that. Again, that's just reading into the text things that aren't there. And that subject, I mean, it's something we're going to pick up later on, of course, when we get to this passage. But just a side note here, if the temple had been destroyed and John would have been asked to go and measure it, he would have been shocked. Also, it would be extremely strange that such a cataclysmic event, such as the destruction of the temple, isn't mentioned in the book of Revelation. If the book was written in the late 90s, for instance, we're saying that the temple's destruction would have been taking place less than 30 years prior to that, and it doesn't even get a mention. That would be like us writing the history of New York and making no mention of the destruction of the World Trade Center in 2001 at the hands of terrorists. Not conclusive evidence, but it is odd. And then in Revelation 17, we see a reference to 7 kings or Roman emperors. And the book of Revelation seems to have been written during the life of the sixth one. And if one starts with Julius Caesar and then counting, then Nero would be the sixth king, and he would be alive at the time, which seems to fit with our timeline. I'll let you read that text in Revelation 17, verses 9 and 10, that seem to point that out. A final point that Kelly makes in his commentary is that the imagery that is used in the book of Revelation fits with the Jewish war in 70 AD. For instance, the reference to horses and swords. Some have suggested that what was pictured here is a war that is yet future to us, but yet military might has greatly changed. Horses and swords were traded for airplanes and tanks and missiles. Kelly says that it takes a violence of interpretation to the text to get the military equipment spoken to mean anything but typical first century hardware. So I've just spent a short time here on what we would call internal evidence for an earlier dating of the book of Revelation. It's important to note that this isn't the whole story or the whole case for an earlier date. I don't want to just get into a whole bunch of evidence and just get bogged down with all of this internal and external evidence for a date either direction. I believe I haven't been convinced, I guess, by a later date. I'm convinced that the book was written earlier. I will say that a later date is the predominant view today, but I'm not convinced by that. There's a guy by the name of Kenneth Gentry, and he did his doctoral dissertation on dating the book of Revelation, and his dissertation is found in book form. You can buy the book. His book's called Before Jerusalem Fell, and it's considered the most detailed examination of this subject. The interesting thing about Gentry's work is that he lists over 130 very notable scholars that have opted for an earlier date in the book and dating it before 70 AD. So I think it's reasonable. I think that you're not going against the grain of history, even though the predominant view today is a later date and dating it after the destruction of Jerusalem. I think there's a lot of reasons, and we can get into that, and we might do that later on, why people opt for a later date. I think that would be an interesting discussion, because I think there's some interpretive reasons why people choose that, and it's not about the evidence. I think the evidence clearly points, and I think Gentry does a wonderful job of pointing us to the evidence that suggests it was written before the destruction of Jerusalem, and that a lot of the events in the book are written with the destruction of Jerusalem in mind, which really makes sense, because then the people at the time that were reading this letter that John was actually writing to and had in his mind were helped and encouraged by this letter. So thanks for listening to the Exploring Revelation podcast today. I hope that you found this material helpful and engaging, and we are on Apple Podcasts, I know, Podbean. You can find us there. We would love, if you enjoyed this podcast, we'd love to have you give us a good review on those sites. If you have comments, like I said earlier, you can head to our church website, bethelmbchurch.org. You can click on the Connect tab there, and you can send us a note there. You can email me at coltar@gmail.com. love to hear from you. Love to hear your questions. We'll definitely try to answer questions as they come up and are related to these things. So if you have questions related to the date or any other issue that we've talked about, or maybe something that you think that we need to talk about as we start heading into the book, we'd love to hear that. And so until next time, take care.